Richard Benjamin Speck, born in 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois. He was the seventh of 8 children. His mother was a religious teetotaler. His father was a packer. In 1947, when Speck was only 6 years old, his father, whom Speck was very close with, died from a heart attack. In 1950, Speck's mother did a complete 180 and ended up marrying a hard-drinking man and moved to Texas. In 1952, Speck's oldest brother died in a car crash. Speck failed the 8th grade, partially because he had a fear of speaking in class and also because he wouldn't wear his assigned reading glasses. He also failed every class freshman year when he got to high school. In 1958, after he was 16, Speck dropped out of high school completely. Speck started to drink by the age of 12. By the age of 15, he was a full-blown alcoholic. He had his first arrest in 1955 for trespassing. This resulted in a very long line of charges over the years for Speck. In 1961, at the age of 21, Speck married 15-year-old Shirley Malone. 3 weeks later, she was pregnant. Between 1962 and 1966, Speck was charged with everything, from disturbing the peace to forgery, burglary twice, and aggravated assault twice. In all, Speck was arrested 41 times in Dallas. Before Speck could be arrested for his last crimes in Dallas, on March 9th, Speck took a bus to Chicago. By March 25th, in Gulfport, Illinois, Speck had threatened a man with a knife. He was detained overnight. By April 3rd, Speck had raped and robbed a 65-year-old Monmouth resident. A week later, Mary Pierce, a 32-year-old barmaid, was found dead on April 13th in an empty hog house behind the tavern she worked and that Speck had frequented. Speck was questioned but left town before he could be further questioned. A search of Speck's room found missing items from the 65-year-old victim that he had raped. On April 19, 1966, Speck returned to Chicago to stay with his sister in Chicago's Irving Park neighborhood. Speck told his sister that he needed to leave Monmouth due to refusing to sell drugs for a crime syndicate. On April 25th, Speck's brother-in-law took Speck to the U.S. Coast Guard's office to apply for a letter of authority. Speck found work, yet argued with the boat officer and was put offshore. Speck stayed at St. Elmo's, a Eastside flophouse on 99th and Ewan. On June 30th, 1966, Speck's brother-in-law, Gene, drove Speck to the National Maritime Union hiring hall at 2335 East 100th Street so that Speck could fill out paperwork for a seaman's card. Wikipedia states that the hiring hall was 1 block east of the address that the dormitories that the nurses lived in was at, but that is not the case. If you continue to read on in the Wikipedia entry, you will see that this hiring hall is 150 feet away from the townhouses. This hiring hall is literally across the street from the townhouses. And Speck visited this hiring hall not only on June 30th, but on July 8th as well, when he went back to the hiring hall to pick up his seaman's card. Another worker with more seniority was chosen, and Speck stayed at a boarding house. On July 12th, Speck again returned to the hiring hall to receive an assignment, but when Speck arrived, the spot had already been taken. This will be the third time that Speck is at the hiring hall, which is 150 feet away from where the nurses live. On July 13th, Speck checked into the hiring hall, then sat in the car with his sister and brother-in-law next to Luella Elementary School across the street from the townhouses. Speck checked into the Shipyard Inn at East 101st Street and Avenue Inn. It was a rooming house. Hours later, Speck accosted Ella Mae Hooper and forced her at knife point back to his room at the Shipyard Inn. Speck raped her and stole her .22 caliber Ron pistol. Dressed in black and armed with a switchblade and a handgun, when Speck left, he walked out about 1.5 miles west on 100th Street toward the nurses' townhouses. Armed, high on drugs, and drunk, Speck broke into the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street that housed student nurses from the South Chicago Community Hospital. Speck went around to the back of the townhouses and cut the screen door. That's how he gained entry. Speck knocked on the first bedroom door, and Corazon A. Morel opened it. Speck pushed her back at gunpoint and forced her, Marlita Gargulo, Valentina Passion, into the room where Pamela Wilkening, Patricia Matuzak, and Nina Schmel were sleeping. Speck then proclaimed that he wasn't going to kill them. A. Morel, Gargulo, and Passion ran into the bedroom closet and held the door closed, yet reemerged when the other young ladies reassured them that Speck said he wouldn't hurt them. One of the young ladies asked Speck what he wanted. Speck claimed he wanted money to go to New Orleans. So one by one, the ladies were allowed to gather their purses and give Speck what little money they had. At this point, Gloria Davy is arriving home from a date. When she tries to open up her bedroom door, Speck opens it for her. After tying Davies up, he placed her on the bed while the other young ladies sat in a line on the floor. Speck untied Pamela Wilkening and led her out of the room. Suzanne Ferris and Mary Ann Jordan had the grave misfortune of returning home to the townhouses at this precise time. The ladies ran into the room with the other nurses, yet Speck ordered them to follow him out. When Speck returned to the room, he untied Nina Schmel and led her out of the room. The nurses all tried to hide, yet one by one he found them, and one by one he led them out of the room. The last victim was Gloria Davy. Speck sexually assaulted Davy while A. Morel hid underneath the bed inside of the same room. Speck then led Davy downstairs to the couch where he continued to assault her. Amaral then crawled under another adjacent bed that had blankets hanging off the side of it. Speck returned to the bedroom, stole the rest of the money from the nurses' purses, and then he left. For 90 minutes, Amaral hid underneath the bed until she heard the 5 o'clock alarm go off. She walked out of the room to a trail of dead bodies. She climbed to the top bunk, opened up the window, pushed out the window screen, and started to yell as loud as she could. "Help! Help! Everyone is dead but me." Whoever did it must be a sex maniac, is what Speck is said to have remarked as he sat at a tavern listening to a news report about the killings as he was drinking with a friend. After a failed suicide attempt, Speck was taken to the hospital where the doctor treating Speck had just read about the murders in the newspaper. As the doctor was wiping blood from Speck's arm, he noticed Speck's "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo and notified the authorities. It was later determined by a panel of psychiatrists that Speck was mentally competent to stand trial and that Speck was mentally competent at the time of the murders. On April 15, 1967, Speck was found guilty on 8 counts of murder. It took the jury only 49 minutes to decide his fate. June 5, 1967, Speck was sentenced to the electric chair. Death penalty laws changed in Illinois, and Speck's sentence was resentenced, and he was given 8 consecutive sentences of 50 to 100 years. But in an odd twist of fate, here's how Richard Speck really ended up.
More shocking than Speck's lack of remorse was his change in appearance. Apparently through the use of hormones, he had transformed his body to ensure his survival in one of America's most dangerous prisons.
He had the certain trappings of a female body that